Alright, today's notes are Chapter 4, Section 1. That needs to be your heading. And the topic of this section is called Federalism. The objectives for the lesson. There's some key terms you're going to need to know here. We're going to talk about them more in the actual notes themselves. Here was your focus for the focus question for today. About power being divided between the federal government and the state governments. Those three vocabulary words in red you will need to know: exclusive, reserved, and concurrent powers. We'll talk about them as we continue on in the notes. So the first thing we're going to talk about is federalism. That's what the whole unit's about. So what is federalism? Well, federal is its root word, right? So it's going to have to be something about the federal government. So the framers, the people who wrote the Constitution, they believed that the government power must be divided. So the framers believed that government power must be divided and limited so that it cannot threaten individual liberties. The Constitution divides powers between the federal government and the states through federalism. So that's important. The Constitution divides power between the federal government and the states through federalism. So federalism is in the Constitution, and it's how power is divided. It creates two basic levels of government that overlap each other. So overlap is just like there's a circle here, there's a circle here. This area of the two circles overlap. The only other thing that you do need to know on that slide is that each level, being the state and the federal, have some powers denied to the other. So there's some things the federal government can do that states can't do, and vice versa. So no new heading. We're still talking about federalism. So federalism is what allows local governments to handle local concerns while the national government deals with national concerns. So federalism allows local governments to handle local concerns. National government deals with national issues. This gives each of the states some flexibility when dealing with challenges. There's some successful state programs like welfare reform that can influence a national policy. Federalism, the other big thing is that it lets the nation respond in a united way to serious crises like war or natural disasters. So that's an important part of federalism, is being able to respond as the federal government when there's a natural disaster that occurs maybe only in a certain state. All right, our next section is going to talk about expressed powers. So that's your next heading, expressed powers. The congressional powers specified in the Constitution in Article 1 include these are the congressional powers. So congressional, that sounds like Congress, right? So this is Congress's powers, are in Article 1 of the Constitution. And that is the power to coin money, to make money, to raise armed forces, and to levy taxes. Those powers are specifically expressed in the Constitution. There are other expressed powers for the President and the Supreme Court that are expressed. So we'll just say that the President and Supreme Court, and then we're just going to write ourselves, have expressed powers. So expressed powers means that it's stated in the Constitution. That is the definition of expressed powers. So the next section is implied powers, and that's exactly what it sounds like. So our next heading is implied powers. So implied powers is where it's not written in the Constitution, but it's power that's implied from the Constitution. So that's where it gets a little tricky, because it's what people are saying, this is what they meant in the Constitution. So it's not written specifically, it's not expressed powers, it's implied powers. So there's a clause in the Constitution called the Necessary and Proper Clause, and it gives Congress the power to make all laws necessary and proper. So Congress gets the power to make all laws necessary and proper for carrying out its expressed powers. So this is an implied power, because this clause was written into the Constitution. It says that you have power, Congress has the power to make all laws necessary and proper to be able to carry out the powers that were specifically expressed in the Constitution. So Congress exercises many implied powers that are based upon its expressed powers. So we're just going to write the example. So you just need to know that Congress uses implied powers. And one example of implied powers that Congress uses includes building the interstate highway system and banning racial discrimination in public places. So those were implied powers that Congress used when they did those two things. So next is inherent powers. So that's your next heading, inherent powers. So every national government has certain powers called inherent powers. These inherent powers are not based on the Constitution. So inherent powers are not based on the Constitution. They include acquiring territory, defending the nation, and regulating trade. So those are inherent powers. Regulating immigration, conducting diplomacy. All right, next is denied powers. That's your next heading. The Constitution denies certain powers to the federal government. So some powers are specifically denied. Okay, specifically denied powers are prohibiting the freedom of religion, speech, press, or assembly. Other powers, like, for example, creating a national school system, that are denied because they cannot be based on any expressed power that's found in the Constitution. And the national government cannot have powers that would undermine the existence of the federal system. So they're denied powers that would allow them to do that. So the next one, that was the what the national government's denied. So this next section is about the state reserved powers. So these are powers reserved specifically for the state. That's your next heading. So the 10th Amendment, the last amendment in the Bill of Rights, right, reserves to the states all the powers that are not given to the federal government or denied to the states. So if the Constitution or the Bill of Rights did not give it to this certain power to the federal government, or specifically say the states were denied it, the 10th Amendment says the state's allowed to have those powers. So an example of some of those powers are police power, which lets the state protect and promote promoting public health, safety, general welfare. Those are powers reserved for the state. State and local governments use a lot of the reserved powers to perform their daily actions. So another good example that you all can relate to is driver's license. So issuing driver's licenses is a power reserved to the states. So most states require a written on test, an on-the-road test, and a vision test. But the age at which teenagers can get a license, the rules that come with having a license that new drivers must follow vary from state to state because that is a state-given power. It's not a federal power. So our next heading are the powers denied to the states. So the Constitution specifically denies some powers to the states. It specifically said. So some of these powers are also denied to the federal government, but some powers denied to the states are exclusive to the federal government. For example, states cannot tax imports or coin money, make money, but the federal government can. So the Constitution says states are not allowed to do those things. The states are denied some powers by the nature of the federal system. So, for example, no state can tax the federal government or regulate interstate trade. So another type of power is concurrent power, and that concurrent means together. So concurrent powers, we're going to write out our definition, are shared by the federal government and state governments. That's what it means. It means that these powers are shared by both the federal government and the state government. They allow the federal system to function. So by having concurrent powers, it allows the system we use, the federal system, to function. They include all powers not exclusive to the national government. So they include all the powers not exclusive to the national government or denied to the states. So anything that's not in those two categories is considered a concurrent power. So local governments use these powers with permission in their state on a regular basis. So sharing responsibility. So that's part of what the concurrent power does, is it lets the state and the federal government share the responsibility. So there are some powers that are exercised by both levels of government, as you can see in the circle. Law enforcement. So here is a local police officer who's with a local sheriff's department or police department. And here you have somebody in the FBI. What does the F in the FBI stand for? It stands for federal. Federal Bureau of Investigation. So police work together, the federal police and the state and local police. That's an example of sharing responsibility and working together. So here in this blue circle, it shows you some of the concurrent powers that the government has. So both the federal government and the state government can levy and collect taxes. They can borrow money, establish courts, define crimes and set punishments. And there's some other things there. Protect national borders, establish police forces, but we're not going to write all of those down. Just know that there are shared powers between state and federal governments. All right, next we have, our next heading is supreme law. So the Constitution, you need to know, is the supreme law of the land, and it's standing above all treaties or acts of Congress. So it's higher than any of those. Below these federal laws come state laws. So the Constitution is the land of the law, and then the law of the land, and after that come federal laws and then state laws. So in this federal system that our government has, state and federal laws sometimes conflict with one another. That's sometimes a problem. The way to settle that is through the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court settles conflicts between state and federal laws. The court can rule that a state or federal law is unconstitutional. If it does that, then either the federal side wins or the state side wins, depending on what the lawsuit is that's brought to the Supreme Court. Supreme law continued. In 1819 case, the Supreme Court case, you just need to know that it's McCulloch v. Maryland. The court ruled that when federal and state laws conflict with one another, the federal law wins as long as it's constitutional. So that's important. And that is the end of your notes video for Chapter 4, Section 1.